Hi guys, welcome to this podcast. I'm planning to do more videos, but I wanted to do this podcast because I have a few things to read to you. So it's a discussion about the Australian wildfires in relation to climate change, and I just wanted to offer some different perspectives. So where should I start? Well, I think I'll start with a question that I had from Musical Neptune, and he said to me, I ignore facts. So my comeback to that would be to say that there are facts and then there are models. And we have to be very careful which ones we are talking about, because climate scientists take a whole range of facts and then they use models, mathematical models, in order to generate projections. The projections are based on the models, which are based on the facts as inputs. But it can also be what we learned in economics, Geiger, garbage in, garbage out. If the model, which these models, I did go to university, I studied economics, mathematics, mathematical modeling, econometric modeling. I understand these models. They are highly vulnerable to the assumptions. They are subject to manipulation, and you have to be very careful with the results they churn out, because they can be kind of subject to construction bias. So therefore, there's a big difference to the facts as presented and what comes out of models. There's also a problem when you look at correlations. I mean, you can correlate buses going in and out of Clapham to birds landing on a roof in Poland. They might correlate, but does that correlation have any meaning? So you also have to be careful when you make these correlations. And then when we talk about these models, we have to look back in the past and say, these people who are creating these models, how often were they correct in the past? And when we look at the range of different information we've had from back in the 70s and 80s when they were warning us of an ice age to now when, it's all about heat, these models have been very ineffective at actually predicting anything. I also think that the current understanding of maths and modeling is not capable of modeling climate. Climate is an extremely complex system of which carbon dioxide is only 3% a factor. And therefore, I think many of these models are oversimplified. They're not grasping the complexity of the matter. And therefore, you can't say to me, facts, 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 because the facts are being plugged into these models to produce these projections, and I don't believe in the models. I would also say that Lord Monckton has talked about many of the models he has done. He has submitted them to be peer-reviewed. And do you know what? In many cases they were returned because the papers to which he'd submitted them said they didn't have any expert with enough knowledge on pure maths or any kind of maths to understand the model. So here we have climate scientists who do not have a sufficient grasp of mathematics to create models that are complex enough to model climate. So the people who are creating these models just aren't up to the job, possibly. And as you know, many of us will speak about on this channel, it's very much political. So that was just to address this point. To go back to Australia, when I've looked at Australia's chart, I feel they are going to use this fire crisis to force out Scott Morrison. He is a climate skeptic. He wasn't expected to beat the Labour Party. As you know, I predicted he would win. He won narrowly. It wasn't expected. I think they're going to use this to force him out and to get someone else into the government. So I see a change in Prime Minister at some stage in Australia. It doesn't really mean a change of government because, like in the UK, we can change Prime Ministers. Whoever rules the leading party is the Prime Minister. So it doesn't mean another election, but they could force Scott Morrison out. I have this article that was on Australian Network. It goes back a few years, and they were talking about whenever a major bushfire catastrophe occurs in Australia, the victims are essentially told to shut up. So they're talking about Victoria's Black Sunday fires in 2009 and the Canberra bushfires, which were 10 years before that, and also in Tasmania. So to quote at the time, the Tasmanian minister said, now is not the time for that conversation, when he had to ask questions about why adequate hazard reduction burns were not done in the cooler months to remove fuel from the path of inevitable summer fires. So my contention is these fires are not so bad because of climate change. They are so bad because adequate hazard reduction burns are not being done. So The residents of Delali, whose town was overrun and whose farmers' properties and livestock were wiped out, they wanted to have that conversation. Those farmers wanted to complain that they were never given a permit to burn off excessive ground fuel. So this is going back to 2009, it's going back to last decade, but you can see that was already happening. So they said the truth was buried for years, but they wanted to point out that a fire that begins in a national park carrying negligently heavy loads of ground fuel can become an unstoppable inferno, which will eventually burst out, possibly even into the suburbs, and kill people and consume homes. So they were warning then that not doing these burn-offs was a problem. They said fuel reduction burns makes it possible to fight and control a fire. But what happened here was uncontrollable. That was a Denali farmer, Lee Arnold, and he reported that to the Australian. So he felt then that the Canberra, I think he was near Canberra, that the fires then were absolutely getting too bad because these burn-offs weren't happening. So he said greenies who oppose such burn-offs care more about birds and wildlife than they do about people and farms. But what's the point? The hills and the trees they told me I couldn't burn off because there were protected eagles and swift parrots there are now all burned. And the fire it created was so hot we have dead swans dropping from the sky. He said the only permissible comment on a bushfire catastrophe is to say it was caused by climate change. It's a convenient get-out-of-jail-free card for greenies, governments, and the obstructive bureaucracies that they form. So I feel it's very much the same now, but on a much worse scale. So that article, that was people warning back in 2009 that this is what could happen if they continue to block the burn-offs. And the reason they're blocking these burn-offs is also so Australia can reach carbon targets or carbon quotas, what do they call, carbon trade-offs or whatever, that system by Al Gore, your carbon credits. So that, not only that, this happens in the UK with flooding as well, where farmers who have traditionally, over the centuries, dredged through the streams and the rivers, they stopped doing so because it ruins the habitat of the badgers and their wildlife concerns. But when you don't dredge the rivers, you get flooding, and the damage from the flooding ends up being worse for the whole environment. So again, it's a case of things not thought out, which I think, to me, this whole green policy is never thought through. They think one step ahead, but they never see the domino effects and where it's leading. So, just to quote, I listened to Piers Corbyn, the brother of Jeremy Corbyn, as you know, is an astrophysicist, and he talks a lot about climate. He was on the Mike Graham show before Christmas. He was very interesting, and I wanted to chat about some of the things he raised. Well, he was saying, while they are now demonizing coal and oil, we live in a world of relative plenty, and there's whole industries have come about. The middle class has been created partially because of coal and oil and the benefits they've brought us. Going back to carbon neutral is virtually a return to the Stone Age. He also talks about how we're led to believe that these Extinction Rebellion people, they're kind of hippies, but they are extremely well funded, they're well organized. Soros has funded them to the tune of 28 million there. They're not just a disorganized group of hippies who are concerned about the environment. There's a lot going on behind that. And what is the agenda? The agenda is world government. It's less freedom. It's less capitalism. It's more control. It's a domination by major corporations and elites. As Piers Corbyn was saying, this is the first time there's going to be not the first time, but there's going to be a redistribution of wealth upwards. And that's what people need to wake up to this climate agenda. It's a redistribution of wealth upwards. He talks about these people assemblies, which they are pushing, the Green and the Climate Extinction Rebellion, all those people. They want to have a people's assembly, and it's a way. And Piers Corbyn says they already have these assemblies in some local governments, and it turns out that it's just a way of local councils and governments avoiding responsibility for stupid decisions because they can blame it on these unelected people's assemblies because they effectively take over the agenda. The media control all the information on climate, and they're very good at being pejorative to anyone who wants to question it. You're effectively called either far left or far right, or you're a conspiracy theorist if you want to have a sensible conversation about it. As the article here said, the only permissible comment on a bushfire catastrophe now is to say it was caused by climate change. As you will note on all our media, there's no discussion of anything else. If there is, it's extremely brief and muted. Piers Corbyn was saying how the IMF are not giving funds to African countries to build new coal power stations, which is effectively keeping Africa backward, keeping people uneducated. He said 1 million women a year in Africa die because they work over fires. Well, they don't have electricity, so they're cooking over open fires and they are dying. So therefore, it's stunting the growth in Africa. But of course, you know, it all runs on guilt. As I said in my one of my other broadcasts on climate change, it's actually very much like a religion, because it runs on making you feel guilty, making you feel like you're a sinner, and therefore wanting you to reform and subscribe to their cult. And I mean, I see it's actually working on people, this whole guilt trip thing, especially being pushed through people's children, because they want to show a good example to their children. It really is working. Now, Piers Corbyn, I will just put this out there. I'm not saying I agree or disagree with this, because I have no reason to agree or disagree, but I think it's worth noting. He says the world is getting cooler in terms of the snow cover at the Christmas 1819, end of last year, in the Northern Hemisphere was larger than ever before. He says the area where one can grow wheat in the United States has decreased, also where you can grow maize. More crops globally are experiencing hail damage, and he says we're heading towards a mini ice age where it's actually getting cooler. He goes on to say that in many cases these bushfires are deliberately started. I have seen random articles on people starting these. Not all of them were totally, as always with these bushfires, very often that they are started or by negligence, usually by negligence. So he goes on to say that many of these environmental crises are actually engineered. There are money which is spent managing watercourses has decreased. Money that would have been spent managing undergrowth in forests has decreased, and this encourages natural disasters. And I do know in the California wildfires, that was another thing that came out, that it was again forest management. Funding for forest management is down, therefore the relevant combing, or whatever they would call clearing the undergrowth, or as in Australia, the permits for controlled burns are being denied, or it's not being done. So it's setting the stage for more of these disasters to happen. And of course they are catastrophic. They are terrible. The human cost is appalling. And obviously people will look at it, and the uninformed masses who watch it will feel very concerned, and they will feel inclined to go along with this climate change because they're seeing more of these. I mean, most people will think it's logical. They'll think years back these fires weren't as bad, there weren't as many, therefore maybe it's climate change. People will logically make that deduction if they don't know the information we're discussing here, will they? So the flooding of the Somerset levels, that was also schemed ahead, and it's even in a UN report. As you know, in my broadcast that I did on Agenda 21, I talked about how part of Agenda 21 is to re-wet or re-wild large swathes of the American countryside. It goes for other countries too, and that's why so many farms are being taken up in the Oregon area. You would have remembered, if you follow, what's that guy's name? Mike Rivero. He talked a lot about the Bundy trial, where they are reclaiming so many farms up in the northwest of America. And I even linked the farm murders that are going on in South Africa with this, to the reclaiming of the farms. So, as I say, it's part of Agenda 21 to want to push people more and more into the cities, or more and more into certain areas, and to leave areas of the country totally open to the wilderness. But that's also going to have a big impact on farming, and going forward we are losing so much farming land, which please do watch for more on that. And for Depopulation Agenda 25, I'm going to be talking about Neptune and Aries and some quite weird things that could be connected to Neptune and Aries, including depopulation. So I was watching another very interesting vlog. It's called The Crow House. It's an Aussie guy, and he was talking about what's been going on with the management of lakes, dams and rivers in Australia. So we're back to Australia now. So he says usually the monsoon season will fill up the Artesian Basin, and that in turn fills all the coastal aquifers, and that brings the cities their water. But for some reason, these monsoons aren't happening, and the country's drying up. At this stage, I'd just like to say that in many cases we focus on temperatures, but what causes high temperatures is actually flows of weather. So I'll talk about the UK, because obviously I'm living here, I watch the weather here more closely. During the summer, when we get those periods where we have a heat wave, where we'll go for a week where it's over 30 and maybe we hit 38, what's happening is hot air that develops in central Spain, very, very hot air, moves up through, up into the UK because of a high pressure system. And the high pressure system, it gets caught over the UK and we get this heat wave, right? And it'll stay there until a flow from the Atlantic moves in through Ireland to shift it away. So you guys will know that the reason we have a kind of mild climate in the United Kingdom is because of the Gulf Stream. So the Gulf Stream is a motion that brings relatively warm air from the Caribbean, goes up through sort of the Americas, and it brings warm air into the UK from Ireland into Scotland. That's why in Invergarten in Scotland there's even palm trees. It's relatively speaking, warmer on that coastline because of the Gulf Stream, and that's what means it's always brought England a mild climate. However, if the Gulf Stream was interrupted and we got more cold air coming down from Iceland, the Arctic, and Norway, our climate would become very, very much colder. So you would have heard in the past, they used to talk about it would be devastating for UK farming if the Gulf Stream was ever disrupted because we would get all this cold air. So by that token, when we get this very hot air, it's also because of flows. So sometimes these hot temperatures have nothing to do with global warming. They're to do with the various flows and how the flows are interrupted. So in Australia, they would usually, like I was saying, they said on the Crowhouse, be getting the monsoon, which would fill the Artisan Basin. But this monsoon weather has shifted down, so Tasmania was getting far more rain than they normally would at this time of year, whereas to the north, in New South Wales and Victoria, they are getting far less rain. What is that? It's because the flow has shifted downwards. Now, why that's happening, I don't know. But weather manipulation is certainly a thing. I mean, you can even go online, and if you've got £100,000, you can actually organize a clear day on your wedding, because they'll send planes up which put certain chemicals, one of them is barium, into the clouds to dissolve the clouds over the area where you're getting married, so you get a clear day. That is a real thing. You can go to websites and you can actually purchase that service. So for anyone who thinks that climate manipulation can't happen, don't be fooled. I think it's possible they are using weather radars in order to shift the weather so that some areas get more rain, like we're seeing this shift down into Tasmania, where Tasmania is getting all the rain and therefore the rest of Australia isn't. There are always airflows. Didn't you notice it was rather odd? We got such hot bank holidays. Every time a bank holiday was coming in 2019 in UK, it was really hot. And sometimes the weather before had been very mild, and then all of a sudden there was this heat wave, because it boosts the economy, of course, if there's good weather on a bank holiday. I was a little bit suspicious of that. Okay, that's a conspiracy theory, I admit. I did go there. But as I say, we have to be careful when we're talking of places having record temperatures. Don't just look at the temperature. Look at the flow. Was the usual weather patterns disrupted? Was there a high pressure that pushed either north or south from another very hot area that brought this flow in? And was that high pressure uninterrupted by the usual weather system for many days? Because that is what produces these very, very hot temperatures, where you get these high pressure systems that don't move and are not swept away by a normal flow, as they would be, like I say, in the UK, a hot weather system moving up. Sometimes it starts in the Sahara, moves through Spain, moves in, and then it just sits in the UK without being moved away by the cooler Atlantic breeze. So think of that when you think of hot temperatures. Is it the temperature, or are the flows being disrupted by something else? So on the Crowhouse, he was also talking about, obviously the drought and everything. He says it's part of the overall plan. So he was talking about the Darling River in New South Wales. It is actually dried out, and he showed some pictures of it. The Darling River, I'm sure you would have all learnt about it in geography at some stage. The Darling River, I certainly did. And he said it was the greatest river system with 1,500 kilometers of river, which are now empty. And it's not due to drought. He said it's due to floodplain harvesting, where they remove the trees and they kind of level off areas, putting embankments, and they actually stop water from getting into the river. It's called floodplain harvesting, and the Darling River is actually dry now because of that. He was also talking about many private dams being built for major agriculture companies. 30 million was paid for two dams out of taxpayer money, and he said these do nothing for the farmers and they do nothing for drought-stricken areas. It only does something for these big companies. So he was also saying that many of the dams, which are effectively subsidized by taxpayers, do make the problems of the Murray Basin far worse. That's the collection of rain in the Murray Basin, and he says this is kind of deliberate. He then goes on to say that the fracking wells, there are over 43,000 fracking wells in Australia. Each uses between 1.5 to 16 million gallons of water, and he said this is just unconscionable in one of the driest countries on the planet. To do fracking, which is so water intensive, is really a bad idea as well. So he was saying about how we shouldn't underestimate geoclimate engineering. Like I was saying about the flows, he said they are using radar to create high pressure systems to create heat surges. So that's basically what I was trying to say in my layman's terms. But basically, he showed a picture of how many weather radars there are in Australia. And he said there are an extraordinary number of them, some of them very closely clustered together. And it seems like there's an exorbitant amount, far more than it would be necessary. And here he wonders if these are being used to direct these weather systems and create these high pressure surges to create these very intense temperatures. He says it can effectively push the hot weather away, weather towards certain areas and push rain away. So it creates a problem. For people who were in doubt, he mentioned that there was actually a document tabled by the British House of Commons on climate remediation, and there are many books written by climate change people themselves, so it's definitely not, it's not a pseudoscience, it's not a conspiracy. Climate remediation or climate control, climate manipulation certainly helps. Again, he talks about fires burning hotter than ever. There were many documentaries on the California wildfires, and we also saw this when I chatted about Notre Dame, how these fires are burning hotter than ever. Just a little note, I'm going to be doing an addendum to this broadcast where I discuss the extraordinary number of fires that have happened in the UK in the last year. There was actually an article in The Independent, but I've made a list of additional fires I've noticed. I've noticed these fires in the UK are far more frequent. And I wanted to discuss this because it was something that came up during the Notre Dame fire as well. Just to end off, one of the chemicals they use when they do this cloud seeding, like I say, you can pay to have the clouds dispersed over your wedding. One of them is barium sulfate. Other chemicals they use are aluminium oxide, strontium. These are used in these weather manipulation. And the guy at the Crow House was saying in soil samples and water samples taken, there are now increasing levels of these minerals in the soil. That's sulfates, aluminium oxide, barium sulfate, strontium, and a few more. Those are the main ingredients. And so they're using those for the cloud seeding, or some of those for the cloud seeding. And he likened them, or one of his commenters, one of his subscribers, should I say, likened those to the ingredients of sparkler dust. And he wondered if the presence of those is not actually making these fires more intense. So obviously, they're sprinkling them in the clouds, they settle onto the ground, and then because they are almost incendiary, or incendiary minerals or sulfates, they are making these fires more intense. It's a theory he had. Maybe you guys can comment if you know more about chemistry than I do on that matter. He also, just to end off, had a very interesting insert of a weather broadcast that happened in Australia, and people were reporting over the fire zones seeing strange shapes, strange patterns in the sky, strange cloud patterns, sort of a weird pinky colour, and they'd reported it. And on the news broadcast, they said they rang the Meteorological Society, and they said, yes, they were doing, he said the Australian military was spraying small metal fragments in order to shield their military planes doing exercises. So that was an official comment that people weren't just crazy in seeing these strange formations. They were actually small metal fragments shielding military planes. Now, that was happening since the fires have been raging. It seems an extraordinarily risky thing to do, to be spraying things over a fire zone. I mean, come on. Is that a good idea? Could that not possibly make it worse? Or is there something going on with these military planes as well that we don't know about, and that was an excuse? All seems pretty odd. So in light of the Australian fires, I wanted to do this broadcast. For you guys who've listened to the end, I've definitely got something coming on Iran that I'm hoping to do today. So that'll be a full video. So look out for that one. Thank you for listening. Thank you for subscribing. Appreciate all comments. Apologize for the podcast, and I hope the sound quality on this was as good as it can be. Thanks, guys.